It's been a hot minute since we've sat down for a jam session with everyone's favorite biotech finance guru, Allan Shaw, but that changes today. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech. And on today's show, Allan and I are going to be talking about biotech leadership, planning, and strategy. And while there's never a bad time to be plotting out your next C-suite talent moves, it's a particularly timely talk right now as stubborn scrutiny and volatility continue to harshly persecute biotech management missteps that would have likely been handily forgiven just a few years ago. Executive teams in biotech are a study in evolution. They come together over time and with intention. Getting caught without the right people in the right seats at the right times can be costly, but so can putting those people in those seats. On today's episode, I'll interrogate Allan's wisdom gained over a decades-long career in which he's been both a strategic hirer and a strategic hire. Allan, it's good to see you.
Great to see you, Matt. Hope things are all well, and always a pleasure to get together for one of these sessions.
It sure is. Yeah, this one's overdue. We need to get our cadence back, back into a more regular fashion, I think.
I'm happy to do so. And as we head into the fall, this is a great time to do it.
Sure is. Yeah. So I want to start out with, the danger zone, right? I want to start out with a discussion around the dangers in poorly metered hiring moves. And, I asked this like with the backdrop of, some context. I've been reading on the airwaves, some of the forums out there, the reflection on some of the companies that have fallen on hard times of late and let a lot of people go. And I often see finger pointing around executive hiring strategy. I don't know how much of that is bluster, how much of it's true, but what, from your perspective, what are some of the dangers that lurk in poorly metered hiring decisions?
Certainly given where we are as an industry, it's certainly always a good time to kind of reflect and take stock on what works, what doesn't work. And I guess it's also important to eternalize that one size doesn't fit all, but these are general guidelines and practices. I think generally speaking, you do want to be early than late when you bring resources on board. But, you have to be thoughtful about it, too. If you bring in an elephant and there's only a few mice, the elephant isn't going to stick around. It's not going to be interesting enough. So, it depends on where the organization is and how the organization evolves. I think going back to, your specific question, I'd call out a couple of areas to talk about and focus on. One is certainly, I think there's some inevitably blind spots in decision making. And I think a lot of decisions many times are fear driven as well, based on insecurity or the perception that they should be doing something. One major risk is that people often know what they know, but they don't always recognize what they don't know. And these are important blind spots. And, I think be able to expand around that and get input from others, help, talking to the board, talking to your organization, thinking about what you really need is important, and understanding the implications to your culture as you do it as well. I think there's also fear-driven decisions. In the absence of good information, fear and insecurity can drive poor decisions. This often manifests in hiring decisions based on perceived expectations rather than the actual needs. And I think as people think about, for example, that they have aspirations for it to be public at some point in time, they have certain concerns about where they are relative to where they should be from an organizational perspective. So those are some of the things to be mindful of as you think about it, and often can lead to bad decisions.
Yeah. Where does that, just to follow up to that one, where do you see that pressure coming from? Like in fear-driven decisions, you talked about perceived expectations rather than actual needs. Is that sort of is it a shareholder, a perceived shareholder pressure, board level pressure, investor level? Like where's that pressure coming from?
I think it's probably the endpoint is what's driving that, right? If you're looking to be a public company, and you're looking to be a public company, over the next year. And that's somewhat bold given the fact that it's been very hard to go public. But from my perspective, I think that's a really realistic expectation with interest rates starting to come down now, with the election behind us in short time. I think it's going to be much more fertile, and I think there are a lot of organizations that have done crossovers and are ready to go that are just sitting on the runway. So I think as that starts to open up, I think IPO aspirations are very real. And I think there's then a level of expectation that when the company is ready to go, when the window is open, that you're ready to go, right? And that leads to, starting your car and letting the engine run for a while. So, you need to gauge a little bit of what, the pathway that you need to go. Usually you do a crossover round and there's steps along the way. And as you move along the way, you need to, I guess there's an investor expectation that you have your house in order and that you can do things. And again, given the emphasis on determining whether or not you even have a business, right? You need to kind of get answers scientifically. I think it gets people into a position, well, when do we start building the rest of the organization?
Yeah.
And I think that's where some of those, and where the anxiety comes from. And it's good anxiety because directionally they're correct. But, there's a lot of steps in the way in terms of how you stage your organizational build out. And I don't know if it necessarily has to be the immaculate conception.
Yeah. Yeah. When I asked that first question, I was sort of dancing around, this idea that when companies fall on financial hard times, a lot of finger pointing starts happening around the executive leadership team. And an example that strikes me, like right now, I mean, this episode will drop a few weeks from now, but like in the moment that we're in right now. A few weeks ago, I had Rahul Kakar on the podcast. He's the CEO at Tome and Tome Biosciences. They, raised a couple $100 million, I think, last spring. They're in a tough spot right now. They made an acquisition. They spent a lot of money on a company recently, but they're in a tough spot financially right now. And there's, they're dealing with those consequences. They just let a whole bunch of people go. They got some bad press. And when you read into the weeds, you start reading the commentary on the forums from industry observers, shareholders, even biotech employees. A lot of finger pointing happens, like, whoa, look at all the money they're spending on their executive leadership team, And I go, I don't know. I don't know that that's going to contribute mightily to the downward spiral of a $200+ million funded company. But you tell me, like, I'm curious about that. Do you think that overzealous spending on high dollar, C-level leadership can or does contribute to, the runway running short, and why or why not?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting question, and certainly I've seen criticism like that attributed elsewhere. And, I think when things aren't going well, right, I think the salaries that compensation that executives of troubled companies receive becomes a little bit of a lightning rod. And I think, and I get that, but I also would call out in this industry where there's a lot of industrial jeopardies and binary risks.
Yeah.
That, it's, a company could be well run and still have issues like that. uh, at the end of the day. But it's certainly easy to be a Monday morning quarterback and criticize people after the fact. If everything was going good, no one would have a problem. And then it becomes a decision of whether or not those people should be retained or not. It's not whether or not they should be getting paid. Everyone should be getting paid. But whether or not those were really the right hiring decisions, whether they were the right fits, there's other questions to be asked as opposed to how much money they're necessarily making, in my view. Leadership versus resource allocation. I'm not sure if it really works that way. I think building out a C-level leadership doesn't automatically lead to running out of money. But it certainly ties into how an organization prioritizes and allocates its resources.
Mm-hmm.
And you shouldn't be, and I think it talks about fit. It also talks about the kind of person that you want in your organization, right? I think a lot of us are generally working, to make an impact. And the benefits associated with making that impact will result in wealth creation. The salaries pay our bills at the end of the day. It's a punch in the clock. And what I've often marveled is that when you see companies that are broken companies that are reverse merger candidates, it asks the question, why are these people sticking around? The equity isn't worth anything. And those people are probably casting the wrong roles because they're very happy just collecting their cash and they're not looking to, move the needle at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I would also call out that, a balanced approach to scaling an organization is also crucial. The key is ensuring that the company's value drivers, like development programs, are adequately funded to reach critical inflection points, while simultaneously bringing in the necessary expertise to inform optimal decision-making and resource deployment. I think before, you build the whole house, you want to make sure that the fundamental plumbing is working and ready to go. And then you can certainly scale accordingly. And I think you need to, when I talk about development programs, it's not just making sure that the programs are fundamental and that you're going to be delivering some good data, but I think you also need to understand, what are you going to need to do organizationally to grow that? What are your inflection points? What are your timing? Because again, if you're looking to go public as well, you need to have all of these things identified because timing is really important. Otherwise, it's also the tail wagging the dog. You do need to understand how to build the organization. And I think the organization follows really the development programs. Also, time is a critical factor. Many factors influence these decisions, but one constant remains: time is the enemy. The time and cost associated with poor decision-making can never be recaptured. Time is lost and you never get that back. So you do need to think about, not being, so focused on today's cost if it's going to have a real impact on tomorrow. And that's a balanced thought. I'm also often advocate that you don't want to get too much in front of your skis, but you can never lose cost of time. And I can't say enough about it. Yeah. But ultimately, the real question is, how can companies source the expertise that they most need on a practical basis? Because there's no dispute that adult supervision is required. But the shorter answer is one size doesn't fit all. From a resource perspective, it may not be practical or even prudent to fully build out a C-level team. Instead, companies might consider more thoughtful scaling approaches, like utilizing C-suite executives on a fractional basis, while leveraging others to build out functionality along with processes. A good example, it would be, do you need to bring the CFO in day one, or can the CFO help with providing guidance, helping strategically, helping with the selection of a controller who can then actually come in and put in the foundational, purchase to pay processes and safeguard your cash, and also make sure that the underlying accounting is in order and that you have audited financial statements, which are prerequisites for going public. You know, that's just an example.
Yeah.
And I guess to kind of distill that, you know, if a company can't afford the entire cow, the fractional approach allows them to buy the steak instead, and providing access to really the expertise needed to avoid costly mistakes without overcommitting resources to manage the company's growth and organizational needs responsibly.
I want to, let's jump into that a little bit. This discussion around fractional leadership versus bringing people on full time right out of the gate. And I want to kind of balance this. I wanted to ask you a question around conversations that I've had with biotech leaders who, tell me when they're talking about hiring strategy, and oftentimes this comes along with them mentioning a very specific person, like, I've got Allan Shaw on my team. Allan Shaw joined my team because he was available. He's a ringer. So I went out there and I hired Allan Shaw. They tell me that they hire these executives when they're available, not necessarily when they're necessitated. So I'm going to ask you a number of questions about this, but and how that sort of aligns with this fractional hiring mentality. Other biotech execs tell me like, hey, I'd really like to have Allan Shaw on my team. I'm going to have Allan Shaw on my team. I don't really think I need Allan Shaw yet, but when I need Allan Shaw, I'm going to go get Allan Shaw. What's the right approach there in your mind? Is it like, hey, this person's available, maybe it's a chief regulatory officer, for instance. We all know that like there comes a pretty distinct point on the clinical path where if you don't have a chief regulatory officer advising you and leading that function, you're probably going to be in big trouble. But maybe it's 2 years before you need that chief regulatory officer, but the one you want is available. Do you go get her, or do you wait until you need her?
It's such a real life situation, and it's one that I've been in conversations many times, and really on both sides of the conversation. And again, cash, financial resources is a rate limiting factor in terms of when you bring people on. If you're expecting data, do you wait till after you get the data? What happens, if this doesn't work, we're actually going to have to start laying people off as opposed to bringing people on. So, there's tension throughout all this process. Many times I've seen conversations that, we should talk in 6 months, or we should talk in a year. But I certainly respect it. And then you also have to ask yourself, when you bring somebody in and the company isn't ready for that, are they going to be happy? Is there enough there for them right now?
Yeah.
If going into a company full time that just completed their Series A, I don't think necessarily makes a lot of sense for the company. There's just not enough to do. Maybe if you expand somebody's role, you can do it. Yeah, I'm the chief operating officer, CFO, and chief HR and administrative officer. Okay. My role's expanded, but am I happy? I don't know. So, I think it makes sense depending on the circumstances and how far off you are, because it should be win-win for everybody. The idea of hiring top talent whenever available, regardless of the immediate need, is similar to the strategy of successful sports teams that draft the best athlete available rather than filling a specific position. But I would also say that while it sounds rather idealistic, it's probably much easier said than done.
Yeah.
I would also, carrying on, I think when you think about the prioritization of needs, I believe that, in applying the Maslow hierarchy of needs to drug development, it serves as a guide for determining when hiring top talent is truly necessary versus when it might be an unjustifiable luxury.
Mm-hmm.
And again, bringing in expertise doesn't necessarily mean hiring. There are a lot of different ways to, inform your activities, to execute, to work around issues without necessarily bringing, hiring somebody full time. But, going back to your point, if you're one I see and living with, we're talking about a company that's talking about going into the clinic, right? They're saying, the use of proceeds, we're going in and we're running phase 2, but they don't have a chief medical officer on staff. In my mind, that's probably something that needs to be spoken to, and I think people certainly understand that you may not be able to afford one right now. But I think then speaking about what is that phenotype that you're looking for? What are you looking for to augment the team? So I think those things are important to be aware of as you execute. And then ultimately, we're in the business of drug development. And without data generation, there's no de-risking. And as the saying goes, in God we trust and in data we believe. This underscores the importance of aligning leadership hires with the critical stages of development and data generation.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I've noodled on several different occasions and had conversations with biotech builders about is sort of that, the critical stages of development, data generation, aligning with your key leadership hires. In your experience, is there sort of a general playbook in terms of the cadence at which cadence and order, right? Cadence and order of hires. We kind of talked about cadence. Cadence is a cash dependent thing, but if I'm starting out as a biotech builder, I've never done this before. Is there a general rule? Like, well, the first thing I need is a chief scientific officer. The next person I'm probably going to need is somebody to help me with my finances, maybe a CFO. At some point after that, maybe a chief technology officer would be great. Then a chief medical officer, and then a chief regulatory officer. Like, is there an and then, or is that highly dependent?
I would say that there's probably, if you're in the business of drug development, you probably need somebody to underpins the technology. From what I've seen, either the company's founded by the technology, whether it's been insourced, there's a champion behind the technology. But they could be a business person or a scientific person. So yes, I think begins with the technology, and it should be coupled with a business person, which could be the CEO. And if the CEO is a scientific person, you might want to pair them with somebody with a business orientation. But I think initially, the most important thing is does the dog hunt? Does the technology work, and what's the plausibility for that? What's the hypothesis, and what needs to be done to support that hypothesis? And so it really depends where you are in the journey of the drug candidate, or if you're preclinical, where are you in terms of nominating a candidate? So I think there's different aspects to it, but you're absolutely right. I think the foundational leadership evolves in stages, bring in the credibility and expertise is needed. And again, I think it speaks to why a fractional approach could make sense, again, depending on where you are in your evolution. I think, again, it comes back to focus on the product development plan. I can't emphasize enough the importance of nailing down a product development plan with meaningful milestones that guide the financing strategy and the leadership build out. I would also call out the need to pay attention to medical affairs early on. Successful companies really do pay attention to this early on, cultivating meaningful relationships with the investigators and the clinicians. It's really important. It helps on so many different levels. It helps drive patient accrual. Also, on a financing side, investors don't necessarily always want to talk to the SAB. They want to talk to people that are viewed to be much more objective and independent. So, the medical affairs side of the house, even if you don't have a chief medical officer, it's still something that you want to be paying attention to early on. And moving on, I think the timing of key hires is always a consideration. I think again it follows the development plan, but from what I've observed, and I've noticed that CFOs are typically the last C-suite hire that's
Hmm.
often brought on board before an IPO, kind of akin to Ringo Starr joining the Beatles before they went on tour. But with that said, I think getting a controller on board earlier on, as I mentioned before, to establish the internal control policies and procedures is a good practice. Because I remember when I was many times over the course of my career that if the steam room isn't working, I had no business being on the Lido deck. So you need to make sure that your back office is fine, that you can safeguard your assets, particularly your cash, that you got controls over procurement, and that you particularly during the clinical trial, the CROs aren't so great at it. So you do want to be able to be upfront and negotiate contracts that are, I mean, they're always going to be favoring the CROs, but there are efforts that you can do to level set those. And again, not people aren't necessarily aware of the business side, as the name of this podcast, it's the business of biotech. And sometimes people get lost in the weeds.
You mentioned the chief financial officer is often brought on last in advance of an IPO, which seems like perhaps a strategic move. But have you noticed over the course of your career any trends around executive leadership positions that are most commonly ignored or brought on too late? Maybe not ignored, but brought on too late. Is there a problem area, a trend, a trend in terms of the problem area in executive leadership appointment in biotech, or not? Maybe people make mistakes all over the continuum.
It's a fair question to ask. I would say, it's really about getting to the right answers and being informed in a timely manner. And I think it really comes down to how you source that. And I do think people are late on the draw. I think on the regulatory side, I've seen people, take that for granted and not necessarily cultivate the FDA as they should and interact with them like they should. So, I think, regulatory side, and again, it depends on the company. I've seen companies make bad decisions on hiring the wrong chief medical officer, thinking they needed to hire a chief medical officer. And rather than getting the right one, they just lowered the bar and got who they can get. And
Mm.
sometimes it's a factor of the company and, not get who you want. But so I could say, yeah, definitely time, like going back to time being the enemy. There are decisions that sometimes are made too late. A lot of companies will bring a CFO in late, but they don't have the benefit of having advice along the way and they make bad decisions along the way.
Yeah.
So, I think it's really depends, but I think there's instances all over the spectrum where you either are bringing in people late and making bad decisions prior to that. And I think, unfortunately, there's a situation where you just bring in the wrong person. And then that's also really costly and can set an organization back. And we're not even talking about culture and the other implications.
Yeah. Yeah, bringing in the wrong person. That's a great segue to my next question, because I'm seeing some conflict in some of the words that I hear Allan Shaw talk about. So I want you to straighten me out here on these, right? Like on one hand, there's the old, Allan Shaw standby that in God we trust, and all others must bring data. Love that. And then there's the old Allan Shaw saw that says investors bet on jockeys, not horses. So like in my mind, in my very simple Pennsylvania boy mind, right? There's friction there. There's some conflict, I should say, around companies that maybe aren't data ready, so they just have to trust in God because they're not data ready, but they feel a need to spend money on leadership horsepower because investors bet on jockeys, not horses. Walk me through that. Like how do we resolve that conflict?
Nah, you got me dead in center.
Well, I don't mean to call you out, buddy. You're my friend. I'm not going to call you out. Uh,
No, it's a balancing act. It
you know
really is.
me. I'm always looking for black and white responses, and I know everything's gray here. I get that. I know that.
And sadly, I've learned when I worked abroad that people perceive that there's many different shades of gray as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're absolutely right. Track records are crucial, especially when investors aim to mitigate the inherent risks of the sector, such as industrial jeopardies and binary outcomes. And betting on someone who's done it before, who has much less in way of blind spots, if any,
Hmm.
who is much more secure and not making fearful decisions, but making decisions based on their experiences and facts and circumstances. There's a lot to be said for that. It's really the question of how you do pace, right? I think, the CEO, you want to set the tone at the top, and a good CEO will attract the resources that needs, and a good CEO will know the resources that are required and the most cost effective way to source them. And we'll build an advisory group and get the input on things that need input on. So there's no getting around that. But I think it's really the pace of how you build that out and how you source the rest of the organization. But there's no question about it that past experience is a good predictor for future performance. No question. And management is a great differentiator. Given the numerous factors beyond the company's direct control, capital markets, scientific developments, regulatory hurdles, competition, reimbursement challenges, the quality of a management team becomes the key differentiator in determining success, particularly in turbulent times. So I stand by that in every which way.
Hmm.
My only point is pace, and a good management team can usually, more times than not, generate the financial backing to execute and put a team. And again, I think coming back to time, if you're properly capitalized and you've got a robust development plan, then you need an organization around that. But I still stand by the fact that it's development plan and your development activities that drive the pace of your organizational development.
Yep. Very good. All right. You cleared that up for me. There's no more friction. No more
Uh,
friction.
I'm glad that we were able to harmonize those concepts.
I want to I want to jump back into a conversation that you've dropped hints on multiple times already in this conversation around fractional leadership. I want to dig in there a little bit. And you've got plenty of experience in this realm. I mean, you were you've done some fractional leadership. As I mentioned in the intro, you've been a fractional leader and you've hired fractional leaders. You've got a lot of experience on this. So let's revisit that and maybe start with just summarizing or kind of tightening up when it makes sense to bring on a fractional leader versus going out there and spending big money on that ringer.
No, fair enough. And again, I think, if you want to use an analogy, I would use the gas tank. How much gas do you have in your tank? And that helps inform how fast you drive the car.
Yeah.
And whether or not you can get to your next destination. So, I think figuring out how you do more with less, I think really drives the concept of the fractional approach. Obviously, idealistically, if you can afford it and everyone's going to be engaged and happy, you can have everybody day one. But, you're going to be spending money that could otherwise be redeployed on drug development and what I would otherwise characterize as value creating activities. So you really have to, with that in mind, understand that and tie that to the company's evolution. The decision to bring on a fractional leader versus hiring full time depends on where the company is in its development. Preclinical, clinical, late clinical, or planning an IPO. I think those are important. As you evolve an organization, people, taking it, going back to the Wizard of Oz, people want to know if there's anybody else besides the man behind the curtain. So,
Mm-hmm.
you need a team, and this does allow you to kind of approach it from bringing in the expertise that's necessary to inform good decisions, to inform what you need to do in your clinical plan, in terms of filing your IND, et cetera, and et cetera. And I think, you know, you got to look at this kind of build versus buy type of thing. And, I think there's tipping points for hiring as well. I think that the functional need begins to require more than 50% of someone's time.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good moment to reevaluate the role and understand that. By doing so, it ensures that the leaders are proactive rather than reactive. If you want somebody, I think, that has a view to what's in front as well as what's behind. And I think if you're trying to limit people to time, or if the organization's evolving, at the point that they're at 50% and you need more, you need to start thinking about whether you need someone in there to get ahead of things and being proactive rather than reactive.
Mm-hmm.
I think and I've again too many sad stories where I've seen pitfalls of folks being penny wise but pound foolish, and you need to understand what the long game is, but you also can't get in front of your skis too much. Hopefully, that's not another contradiction.
No, no. I get it. I just a quick follow up on that. You talk about, you know, 50%. Yeah. When a fractional employee gets to the point where 50% of their work is dedicated to your company, and maybe it's time to start looking at bringing that person on full time. If that's the person you want. Like, I'm curious about your perception on the fractional, quote unquote, like, market. I just had a conversation a couple of days ago with a guy who had a fractional chief technical officer, and the guy was working on contract for his biotech, and he wanted the guy on full time, but the guy was happy being a contractor. And only when that guy got to the point where, to your point, he was doing like 60% of his work on this one client, did he even entertain coming on full time. And fortunately for the biotech builder I was talking to, he wanted that guy. So we brought him on full time. Now he's there full time, and it's great. But is there, so this is the follow-up. I'll try to be more concise with my follow-up. Is there like a market of, like, CXO for hire that, the biotech industry can take advantage of, knowing full well that those people are fractional and disposable? Or is it more a case where they have access to a CXO for hire that maybe they want to test drive, try on for size, and perhaps bring on full-time down the road?
There is a market for this, and it's becoming increasingly popular. Certainly for CFOs, there's a number of organizations that do that, and it seems to be growing rather significantly, which I think really underscores the demand and the acceptance as a way of conducting business. I'm not aware, but I believe there are organizations that can provide CMOs under the same type of situation. And then there's a lot of what I would say people who freelance in that regard, who don't necessarily need a broker, right? Why should I be sharing a part of what's being generated with a broker if you can generate it without the broker?
Yeah.
So I think there's a market for it, and I think also I think talking through colleagues. For instance, I connected to a situation from talking to somebody who was in a CEO leadership group. And at the CEO leadership group, someone expressed a need for a CFO, fractional CFO. And that one thing led to another. In another situation, I know people that I've worked with in the past, and they approach you and they say, we want you to join the team, but
Yeah.
we can't, this is where we are in our development. And, so it's only more on a fractional basis. But, I think, for the person that you referred to who really liked doing what they were doing, there's a lot to be said, and I think there's a lot of advantages on a couple of levels. I mean, on a company side perspective, right? You are getting a test drive. If you decide that you might want to try to hire this person in the future, you can see how they fit in, and and you minimize the costs of a bad hiring decision, for sure. On the flip side, the service provider's perspective, it gives them optionality, right? Because even the best in drug development only have, a success rate of what, 10%, 20% maybe. Um, I think having a portfolio approach makes sense from a risk management perspective. What works good for investors can we work for the operator. And I'm certainly quite fond of collecting lottery tickets as I go about my business. And you only need one win to move the needle.
Yeah. Yeah. What other advantages does fractional leadership create for biotech companies? You mentioned a number of them. I just want to make sure I'm not leaving anything on the table here.
No, absolutely. Happy to. Fractional leadership allows an organization to leverage subject matter experts with extensive experience without depleting resources. This is particularly valuable where environments such as the one we're in now, where the cost of capital is extremely high.
Mhm.
And it ensures that the organization benefits from expertise without committing to full-time costs. Um, and if you don't like it, you have the freedom to change to somebody else too. So you minimize the downside, but you are opening up the window to getting expertise that you might not otherwise have. And I think it does reduce your blind spots at the end of the day and allows you to make more informed decisions. And as a constant theme, time is the enemy. You don't get the time back. You make a bad decision. There's time and there's costs. And and people look at runway, but they forget about overhead. Overhead's that silent killer. So, again, you do want to minimize your overhead, and fractional organizations do extend the cash runway.
I I I'm assuming. I mean, I don't even know what they are. Like I'm not going to make any guesses, but there's got to be at least some risk levels around hiring contract employees, fractional employees. So what do biotech leaders who are considering it need to be cautious about? They say, okay, well, I think maybe for all these reasons that Allan Shaw has been expanding and expounding on this episode of the Business of Biotech, maybe it makes sense for us to do some fractional leadership hiring. What do I need to be careful about?
You're bringing somebody into your team, right? So, you should certainly exercise similar care. Um, while they're easier to adjust or replace than a full-time staff, I think it's still crucial to ensure cultural compatibility among other considerations. Referrals are a valuable source to finding qualified people. As I mentioned, many experienced professionals are adopting a portfolio to their careers in life sciences. And I think as a consequence, there's a body of work that can be evaluated as well,
Mm-hmm.
as you talk to them. So, I think a little reference check is helpful. I think looking at their body of work, and I would be probably more focused on not necessarily the references that they may provide, but I think, given that it's such a small sandbox that we live in, I think, just identifying people who may have crossed paths with this person, that's in your network is also a very valuable way of independently vetting a person, whether it's fractional, whether it's full time.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna drill down a little further on that question around risk, because it occurs to me, this is a highly sensitive industry that we work in. I've spent my entire career in the publishing industry, and I've worked as a full-time employee. I've worked as a contract employee. I've been an independent contractor, and even in publishing, I've had to sign a lot of IP agreements, non-compete agreements. In this biotech space, IP is so fiercely protected and so important. Um, what sort of precautions and protections should biotech employers be aware of or considering when they're saying like, hey, I might bring Allan Shaw in as a fractional CFO, not knowing necessarily whether Allan Shaw is also being a fractional CFO for my biggest competitor, someone else is playing in the same indication I'm in with a very similar molecule. Like, what do I need to do to protect myself?
In the situation that you specifically called out, that probably be the end of the discussion.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you build a firewall or a Chinese wall high enough to insulate you against that. Um, but I think sometimes the best decision is the decision not to do something. But I think as a general rule, I think the protections or the safeguards taken for fractional leadership are really similar to those for full-time hires. Their standard agreement should include confidentiality clauses. There should be indemnification, non-poaching of employees, and clear terms for company ownership of any inventions or intellectual property developing during the engagement. Um, so you want to kind of preempt issues of dispute and really it should be clarifying, and so that's very definitive. And these things are done for when you hire a full-time employees, and I think similar practices should be undertaken as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. All right, we're getting short on time here, so I'm going to wrap it up with another question or two, if that's cool with you. We've
Sure.
talked a little, yeah, we've talked a little bit about this, like try before you buy, and boy, I really like this person. I'd like them to be full time. But from a business perspective, just because I think Allan Shaw would be a great CFO full time, and he's been doing good work for me fractionally, it might not be a smart thing to do to go ahead and transition you into the CFO role from a full time from a fractional role. So when does it make sense? Like, what's the writing on the wall that says, you know what, it's time to transition this guy into my full time position?
I would say the when is when the functional need begins to require more than 50% of someone's time. And that's a really good time to reassess the role, understand where you are with your development, understand where you are with your financing. Can you afford it? And I think it's also a good time to also just generally evaluate what other gaps do I have in my organization that need to be addressed. And just as an organization evolves, I'd also call out that, sometimes you're confronted with organizational obsolescence where the organization has grown quicker than the people. And you want to get in front of that as well. It has implications on the culture, it has implications on execution. And as the company's growing, if you can recycle folks and put them in an area for success, as opposed to them being an impediment as the organization evolves, that's can be a win-win for everybody. In respect to the why is transitioning at this stage helps leaders to be proactive rather than reactive, avoiding the mistakes of trying to save money in the short term while potentially causing bigger problems in the long term. I think at the end of the day, you can either allow external factors to manage you, or you can do better job of managing external factors to help derive the outcomes that you're working towards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I feel like we've beat this horse pretty hard today. Like I think we've attacked this discussion from multiple angles and relentlessly. But I'm curious, what am I missing? What should I have asked you? Is there anything I should have asked you that's like an important part of this hiring strategy, and particularly the fractional part is super fascinating to me. But is there a facet that we didn't beat on hard enough or at all?
I would say from a general perspective, I think we covered the concept and the approach to scaling an organization in a responsible, practical manner to achieve your goals without compromising on time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be important to emphasize that, these aren't races, but these are a marathon. And that, you need to kind of thoughtfully think about your development plan and think about how you go about fill in the gaps. I think we go back to the beginning of this thing in terms of decision making. And I think at the end of the day, people make good decisions with good information. And the best way to mitigate the risks that the industry and the drug development pathway has, I think it serves everyone well to make sure that you have the right thought leadership available to execute.
Yeah, very good. Well, it's always a blast. It's always fun talking with you. It's always fun watching your face when I ask you the same question I just asked you in a different set of words, You're you're always a good sport to keep coming back on here and subjecting yourselves to these interviews. And I always have a fun time doing it. So thank you. Lots of insight there. We appreciate it.
Oh, always a pleasure to go back and forth with you, harmonize my conflicts and contradictions. And now I look forward to doing it all again.
Yeah, we need to do it again in person soon. It was JP Morgan the last time we did one of these face to face, and that was a good time. I enjoyed that. So we'll make that happen.
No, absolutely. Let's put our. I think there's more than one way to approach that, but
we'll take that offline.
You betcha.
So that's CFO extraordinaire Allan Shaw. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech. Be sure to visit our videocast page under the Listen and Watch tab at bioprocessonline.com, where you can find this and hundreds of other videos of my interviews with biotech builders. While you're there, subscribe to our Business of Biotech newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB. And in the meantime, we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.